The guard thought it would be a routine removal. Another quiet man lingering where he didn't belong. Another awkward conversation. Another escort to the door. What he didn't know was that 3 federal investigations had already started because of this building, and the man he was about to humiliate was the one person who could shut the entire company down by morning. The lobby of the Argentum Financial Tower in downtown Chicago was built to intimidate. Polished black marble floors, a wall of glass stretching 30 feet high, 3 security stations positioned like checkpoints in an airport terminal. Executives passed through every day with silent authority, expensive suits, polished shoes, and badge scanners that opened doors without a word. The building belonged to Argentum Capital Holdings, one of the largest private investment firms in the country. But the company had a quiet reputation: aggressive acquisitions, silent boardroom removals, and recently, unusual regulatory attention. Most people didn't notice that part, but some did, including the man sitting calmly in a chair near the elevators. Gray coat, simple shoes, no badge, no appointment sticker, no rush, just sitting, watching, waiting. Security guard. Mark Henson noticed him about 10 minutes after the morning rush ended. The man didn't look homeless, but he didn't look like he belonged either, and in a building like Argentum's, that mattered. Henson walked over with the casual confidence of someone who had removed dozens of unauthorized visitors. "Sir," he said flatly. The man looked up slowly. Calm eyes, no reaction. "No public waiting area here," Henson continued. "Tenants only." The man nodded slightly. "I'm waiting." "For who?" "Someone upstairs." Henson glanced toward the elevator bank. No badge, no escort, no sign-in sticker. That meant one thing: this guy was bluffing. "Yeah," Henson said, folding his arms. "That's not how this works." The man didn't argue, didn't explain. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Henson raised an eyebrow. "Mail drops around the corner." The man placed the envelope gently on the marble table beside him. "I'm not delivering it." "Then what are you doing?" The man's voice stayed even. "I'm waiting to see if anyone here recognizes what's inside." Henson sighed. He'd dealt with this before. Weird protesters, confused investors, people trying to make a scene. "Sir," he said firmly, "you need to leave." The man didn't move. Across the lobby, 2 junior executives slowed down near the coffee station, watching, because security confrontations were always entertaining, and the guard was getting impatient. "Last chance," Henson said. "Leave now or I call building management." The man looked at the security desk, then back at the guard. "Go ahead." Henson smirked. Wrong answer. He pressed the radio on his shoulder. "Front desk requesting management." Got a non-compliant visitor refusing to exit. A pause, then a voice crackled back. "Copy. Sending floor supervisor." Henson relaxed. This would take 2 minutes, 3 at most. The executives nearby were already whispering. One of them muttered quietly, "Guy looks like he wandered in from a bus stop." The other chuckled, but the quiet man heard it. He just didn't react. Instead, he adjusted the envelope slightly on the table, making sure the company logo stamped across the corner faced outward, a gold insignia. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but someone inside this building absolutely would. 2 minutes later, the glass doors opened again. A woman in a navy blazer walked in briskly. Lauren Briggs, building operations supervisor, known for handling problems quickly. Henson gestured toward the seated man. Refusing to leave, Briggs approached with professional efficiency. "Sir, this is a private corporate building." The man nodded. "I know." Do you have an appointment? No. Then I'm going to ask you to leave the premises. The man tilted his head slightly. Before anyone upstairs sees that? He tapped the envelope. Briggs glanced down. At first, she didn't care. Then she noticed the seal. Her expression shifted, just slightly, but Henson didn't catch it. What's in the envelope? She asked. Information. About? Your company. Briggs's voice hardened. If this is some kind of complaint, it's not. The man leaned back calmly. It's documentation. Henson rolled his eyes. Here we go. Another amateur investigator. Another conspiracy guy. Ma'am, Henson said quietly. Want me to escort him out? Briggs hesitated, because that seal looked familiar, but it didn't make sense. The emblem belonged to a small oversight division most corporations never encountered directly. A division that rarely appeared in public investigations. A division connected to something called the Federal Corporate Integrity Office. But the man sitting here didn't look like a federal investigator. He looked like someone's retired uncle. Briggs straightened. Sir, she said firmly, if you have documentation, you can submit it through legal channels. The man nodded. I already did. When? 3 weeks ago. Briggs frowned. Then why are you here? The man finally smiled. Not smug, not arrogant, just patient. Because the response was interesting. What response? None. Henson laughed under his breath. Yeah, that's called rejection. The man turned his head slowly toward him. No. His voice stayed calm. That's called confirmation. Henson scoffed. Briggs crossed her arms. Confirmation of what? The man tapped the envelope again. That nobody upstairs realized who the documents were about. A quiet tension moved through the lobby. The nearby executives had stopped pretending not to watch. Briggs exhaled slowly. Sir, I'm going to say this once more. You need to leave. The man looked up at the towering glass walls, the security cameras, the polished marble floor, the enormous Argentum Capital logo mounted behind the reception desk. Then he said something very quiet. Your CEO should probably come down here. Briggs blinked. I'm not calling the CEO because a visitor. You might want to. Henson laughed openly now. Buddy, the CEO isn't coming down because you showed up with an envelope. The man nodded. That's true. Then he reached into his coat pocket again. This time, he pulled out a phone. He typed a single message, sent it, and placed the phone on the table beside the envelope. Henson smirked. Calling your lawyer? The man shook his head. No. He looked directly at the elevators. I just notified someone who owns a controlling share of this company. The two executives across the lobby exchanged amused glances. Because that was impossible. Argentum Capital's majority ownership belonged to a private investment trust, and that trust had exactly one controlling shareholder. But almost no one had ever seen him. Most employees weren't even sure he existed. Lauren Briggs crossed her arms tighter. Sir, she said, if you're trying to impress us. The elevator doors behind them dinged. Soft, quiet, but sudden. And when the doors slid open, the person stepping out wasn't security, wasn't legal, wasn't building management. It was Argentum Capital's chief executive officer, walking fast, with two board members behind him, and the moment he saw the man sitting by the table, he stopped. Completely. The entire lobby felt it. Because the CEO's face had just turned pale. He walked forward slowly. Briggs turned, confused. Sir? But the CEO didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on the seated man, the envelope, and the phone beside it. When he spoke, his voice had lost all the authority it usually carried. Mr. Vale. The lobby went silent, because almost nobody had ever heard that name inside this building, but the executives across the room suddenly recognized it. Nathaniel Vale, the billionaire founder, the majority owner, the man who had disappeared from public view 6 years earlier, and the man security had just tried to throw out of his own headquarters. Henson's face drained of color, but Nathaniel Vale didn't look angry. He looked curious. He lifted the envelope gently, then asked one quiet question. "Do you know why I came here unannounced today?" No one answered. The CEO swallowed. "No, sir." Vale nodded slightly. "That's the problem." He opened the envelope and slid a stack of printed documents across the marble table. The CEO read the first page, and his hands started shaking, because the document wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a threat. It was an audit summary. And stamped across the top were the words, Federal Corporate Integrity Office. Preliminary Review. Vale looked around the lobby calmly. At the security guards, the executives, the stunned CEO. Then he said something that made the room colder than the marble floor beneath them. "This building," he said quietly, "is now part of a federal corruption investigation." And that wasn't even the real problem, because the next name on the audit list was someone standing in the room. The CEO's hands didn't stop shaking. Not when he finished the first page, not when he reached the second, and definitely not when he saw the third. Because the third page had a name highlighted in red, a name that was currently standing less than 10 feet away from him. Lauren Briggs, the building operations supervisor. She noticed the shift immediately, the way the CEO's eyes lifted slowly from the document, the way the two board members behind him leaned closer, and the way the entire energy in the lobby had just changed. "What is it?" Briggs asked carefully. No one answered her. Nathaniel Vale remained seated, calm as ever, watching, observing, because this moment, this exact reaction, was why he had come here himself. Not lawyers, not investigators, not regulators. Him. The CEO cleared his throat, but the sound came out dry. "Mr. Vale, maybe we should discuss this upstairs." Vale didn't move. "No." The word wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. "I think this is the right place." He looked around the open lobby. Employees were beginning to slow their steps now, conversations fading, eyes turning, because the CEO almost never appeared downstairs. And when he did, it wasn't like this. Vale folded his hands calmly. "Public spaces are useful," he said softly. "They prevent selective memory." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, this kind of discussion is exactly the kind that should happen where people can hear it." Vale turned his attention back to Briggs. "You've been building operations supervisor for 3 years." It wasn't a question. Briggs nodded slowly. "Yes. You oversee building security, vendor contracts, facility access logs." "Yes." "And compliance routing for internal document intake." Briggs hesitated. "Yes." Vale nodded once, then he tapped the document again. That's where the problem started. The CEO closed his eyes briefly, because he had already seen the section Vale was referencing. 3 weeks earlier, a sealed compliance package had been submitted to Argentum's internal review channel, marked confidential, federal reference code attached, and routed through building operations, standard procedure. Except, it had never reached legal, never reached the board, never reached compliance. It had simply disappeared. Vale's voice remained calm. 3 weeks ago, I submitted a test file. Briggs blinked. "A test?" "Yes." He leaned back slightly. "A standard corporate integrity audit procedure." One of the board members frowned. You tested your own company? Vale looked at him. Every year. Silence fell again, because most employees inside Argentum had no idea their founder did this. Randomized oversight tests, hidden audits, anonymous compliance checks, small probes into the system. Most companies relied on internal reports. Vale trusted behavior, and behavior always revealed the truth. He looked back at Briggs. The envelope I submitted contained 30 pages. She swallowed. I never saw it. Vale raised an eyebrow slightly. That's interesting. The CEO stepped forward quickly. Lauren, think carefully. Her voice sharpened now. I am thinking carefully. Vale tapped the audit page again. The intake log shows the package entered the building. He slid another sheet across the table. Security camera timestamp confirms it was delivered to operations. Another page. Your badge accessed the document locker 30 minutes later. Briggs's face tightened. That doesn't prove anything. Vale nodded calmly. You're right. Then he turned to the CEO. Tell them about the second part. The CEO looked like he wanted to disappear, but there was no way out now. The documents contained something else, he said quietly. What? Briggs asked. Hidden tracking markers. Her eyes widened slightly. Vale watched her carefully. Each page contained a unique compliance identifier. He paused. Identifiers that later appeared inside internal financial routing reports. One of the executives nearby whispered, What does that mean? The board member answered quietly. It means someone copied the documents. Vale nodded. Correct. He folded his hands again. And used them. Briggs shook her head. This is ridiculous. But her voice wasn't as confident anymore. Used them how? One of the executives asked. Vale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up toward the towering Argentum logo, polished steel reflecting the entire lobby. Then he said something very precise. Inside those documents were 3 fake acquisition targets. The CEO's jaw tightened. Completely fabricated companies, Vale continued, designed to look like distressed assets. Small technology firms. Quietly available. He looked back at Briggs, and within 48 hours, Argentum Capital began preparing private purchase offers. The lobby went silent, because that wasn't just unethical. That was insider manipulation, using internal intelligence to stage acquisitions before competitors even knew assets existed. Except, those companies weren't real. They had been planted inside the audit. Vale leaned forward slightly, and yet someone here started preparing financial movements based on them. He slid one last page across the table. Bank routing summaries, transfer authorizations, preliminary investment holds, all tied to the fake companies. Briggs stared at the documents. Her breathing had changed, but she still tried to hold her ground. I don't handle investments. No, Vale said calmly. You handle information. And that was much more valuable. The CEO rubbed his temples. Lauren, those acquisition drafts came from your department access codes. She looked at him sharply. You're accusing me? Vale spoke before the CEO could answer. No. A small pause. I'm observing behavior. He gestured toward the document again. The question isn't whether information was accessed. That part is already confirmed. The question is, who else received it? The board members exchanged worried looks, because now the implications were spreading. If internal audit data had been intercepted and used to manipulate investments, then Argentum had a leak, a serious one, and maybe something worse. Vale finally stood. The movement was slow but commanding. Security guard Henson instinctively stepped back, because suddenly the quiet man in the gray coat didn't look ordinary anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, the man who built the entire empire surrounding them. Vale turned toward the security desk. "Mr. Henson," the guard stiffened. "Sir, you did your job." Relief flickered across Henson's face. "For what it's worth," Vale continued, "you were the only person here who followed procedure." Then he turned back to the CEO. "Unfortunately, and the same can't be said for your internal controls." The CEO nodded grimly. "We're initiating a full review immediately." Vale tilted his head slightly. "That won't be necessary." The CEO frowned. "Sir?" Vale picked up the phone he had placed on the table earlier. The screen lit up. A message notification appeared. He read it once, then handed the phone to the CEO. The CEO's eyes moved across the screen, and whatever he read drained the remaining color from his face. "What is it?" one of the board members asked. The CEO swallowed hard. "Federal arrival confirmation." A ripple of whispers moved through the lobby. "Federal?" Vale nodded calmly. 3 teams. Already in the building. Almost on cue. The glass doors opened again. This time, not for executives, not for security, but for 6 people walking in with quiet precision. Dark suits, government credentials, and silver badges displaying the seal of the Federal Corporate Integrity Office. Most employees had never heard of them, but the executives had, because this division didn't investigate small violations. They handled systemic corruption, and they rarely showed up without evidence already in hand. The lead investigator approached Vale. "Mr. Vale?" He nodded respectfully. "Director Ames." Then he turned slightly toward the stunned executives around them and said the words that would echo through Argentum for years. "The internal audit worked." Director Ames nodded once. "Yes." His eyes moved across the lobby, stopping briefly on Briggs, then on the CEO, then on the board members. "Which means," Ames continued quietly, "the leak we've been tracking through 3 financial cities is finally visible." And that was the moment everyone realized something terrifying. This investigation was never just about Argentum. Vale looked around the silent lobby, at the employees gathering, at the executives frozen in place, at the federal investigators beginning to spread through the building. Then he said one final line before the room erupted into motion. This was only the first company we needed to confirm, because somewhere above them, someone much higher in the financial chain, had been feeding information through corporations just like this. And now, the investigation had its first doorway, but the name sitting at the top of the next document was someone none of them expected. The lobby didn't erupt the way people expected. There were no raised voices, no dramatic arrests, no shouting. Instead, something much more unsettling happened. Silence. The kind that spreads when everyone realizes the situation is bigger than the room they're standing in. Federal investigators moved with quiet efficiency across the marble floor. 2 headed toward security, 1 toward reception, another toward the elevator control panel. Director Ames remained beside Nathaniel Vale, watching, because the real reactions were happening now, and reactions always told the truth. The CEO stood frozen, still holding Vale's phone. The message from the federal team glowed on the screen. "Entry confirmed, floor access secured." He slowly handed the phone back. "Mr. Vale, how long has this been happening?" Vale slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "Long enough to become predictable." Director Ames added calmly, "Long enough to show patterns across multiple cities." The CEO blinked. "Multiple?" Ames nodded once. Chicago, Atlanta, Denver, Seattle. Each city landed like a weight, because Argentum Capital had investment activity in all four. Vale looked around the lobby again. Employees were now pretending to check their phones, pretending not to listen. But nobody was leaving. Nobody wanted to miss what was happening, because rumors traveled through financial buildings like electricity. And this one was about to become a storm. Briggs finally found her voice again. "This is insane." She looked between Vale and the federal agents. "You think I'm part of some interstate corruption ring?" Vale didn't answer immediately. He studied her carefully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the calm curiosity that had built a billion-dollar empire. Then he said something quiet. "I think you handled information that was valuable." "That's all." Her voice sharpened. "I routed documents like everyone else." "Exactly," Vale replied. And someone noticed. Director Ames stepped forward slightly. "Ms. Briggs, we're not here because of one document." She frowned. "Then why are you here?" Ames reached into a thin folder he had been carrying. Inside were several photographs. He placed them on the marble table one by one. Security footage, different buildings, different cities, but always the same moment. Compliance documents entering corporate intake departments, and shortly after, financial positioning shifting quietly inside investment firms. The CEO stared at the photos. "You're saying someone's watching internal audit channels?" "Intercepting them," Ames corrected. "Then selling the intelligence." Briggs crossed her arms. "That still doesn't explain why you're looking at me." Ames tapped the first photograph. "Chicago intake." Another. "Atlanta intake." Another. "Denver." Another. "Seattle." 4 buildings, 4 corporations, 4 different compliance departments. But in every case, the routing supervisor had accessed the documents before they vanished into internal systems. Vale spoke softly. "The same position." Briggs frowned. "That's not proof." "No," Ames agreed. "It's pattern recognition." He slid one final page across the table. Employee transfer records. Briggs leaned forward slightly. Then her expression changed. Because the page didn't show her name. It showed 4 different names, 4 different supervisors, 4 different cities. But all 4 had something in common. They had previously worked for the same consulting company. The logo at the top of the page read, "Helix Strategic Advisory Group." One of the board members whispered under his breath, "A Helix?" Vale noticed. "You've heard of them." The board member hesitated. "Small consulting firm. Risk management." Director Ames gave a quiet half-smile. "That's the public description." He tapped the document again. "In reality, Helix places operational consultants inside corporations. Temporary positions. Compliance. Logistics. Document routing." The CEO's voice dropped. "Information choke points." Ames nodded. "Exactly." And suddenly the picture became terrifyingly clear. Someone had built a quiet network. Not hackers, not spies, just ordinary corporate employees placed in very specific roles. People who saw information first, before legal, before executives, before regulators, and if they recognized something valuable, they could quietly signal it outward. Vale leaned back slightly. "We suspected Helix 2 years ago." The CEO turned toward him sharply. "You knew about this?" "Suspected," Vale corrected calmly, "but suspicion isn't evidence." "So, you tested us," the CEO said quietly. Vale nodded. "Yes." Briggs shook her head. "You're all insane." But there was something different in her tone now. Not anger, pressure. Director Ames looked directly at her. "Miss Briggs, Helix hired you 18 months ago." She didn't answer. Before that, you worked in corporate compliance in Minneapolis. Still silence. Before that, logistics management in Dallas. Vale spoke quietly. And before that, Helix Strategic Advisory. The lobby air felt heavier now. Briggs looked around the room. At the watching employees, at the federal investigators, at the CEO. Then, finally back at Vale. "You built this company," she said. "Yes. And now you're tearing it apart." Vale shook his head slightly. "No." He gestured around the room. "This company was being used." Ames added softly, "And not just this one." He turned toward the CEO again. Argentum wasn't the target. It was a censor. The CEO frowned. A censor for what? Ames closed the folder slowly. For someone much higher. The elevator behind them dinged again. 2 more federal agents stepped out. One handed Ames a small tablet. He read the screen briefly, then looked up at Vale. They confirmed it. Vale nodded slowly. "Good." The CEO looked between them. "Confirmed what?" Ames turned the tablet around. Displayed on the screen was a financial network diagram. Corporations, investment firms, consulting groups, data routing patterns, and one name sitting quietly at the center. The CEO stared at it. His face went pale again. Because the name didn't belong to Helix. It belonged to something much bigger. A private financial holding network few people ever discussed publicly. Northbridge Dominion, one of the largest shadow investment entities in the global market. Vale spoke calmly. "We believed Helix was feeding intelligence to them." Ames nodded. "And now we know they were." Briggs whispered under her breath, "You have no idea what you're touching." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Vale noticed immediately. He tilted his head slightly. "That's interesting." She froze. Ames watched her carefully. "Why would you say that?" Briggs didn't answer, but the silence said enough. Vale looked around the lobby again, at the executives, at the investigators, at the employees pretending not to stare. Then he said something that made several federal agents exchange glances. "This is bigger than Northbridge." Ames raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" Vale nodded. "Yes." Because something had bothered him since the first audit test. One detail that didn't make sense. He turned back toward Briggs. "You didn't sell the information." She stayed silent. "Someone above you did." Still nothing. Vale continued calmly. "And that means Helix isn't the top layer." Director Ames watched him closely. "You're suggesting another level." Vale nodded. "Of course." He gestured toward the financial diagram. "This network moves billions. Helix employees barely see millions." Ames leaned back slightly. "So, someone's sitting above them." Vale smiled faintly. "Someone always is." The lobby doors opened again, but this time it wasn't federal agents. It was reporters, because news travels fast in financial districts. And someone had already leaked the presence of investigators in Argentum Tower. Cameras, microphones, curious voices gathering outside the glass. The CEO looked panicked. "This will destroy us." Vale shook his head gently. "No." He glanced toward the federal agents spreading through the building. "This will clean you." Ames nodded. "And possibly expose something much larger." Briggs finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think you're winning." Vale looked at her. Calm. Steady. "No." He gestured toward the federal teams. "We're just beginning to see the map." She looked down at the floor, and for the first time, she said something honest. "You're already too late." The words hung in the air. Ames narrowed his eyes slightly. "Too late for what?" Briggs didn't answer, But Vale's expression changed. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. Because he had heard that tone before, years earlier, during another investigation, another company, another city. He turned slowly toward Ames. "There it is." Ames frowned. "What?" Vale spoke quietly. "The thread we've been missing." He looked back at the reporters gathering outside, at the federal agents, at the stunned executives. Then he said something that made the entire investigation suddenly feel much larger. This wasn't the first company under review. Ames studied him. "You're saying there are more?" Vale nodded once. "Yes." Then he added the line that would soon echo across multiple federal offices. And Argentum was only the first one to confirm the pattern. Outside the glass doors, more cameras were arriving, because the story was spreading. But none of them knew the real truth yet, that this quiet lobby confrontation had just opened the door to an investigation reaching far beyond one corporation, far beyond one consulting firm, and, possibly, far beyond one country. Vale looked toward the elevators one last time, calm, unshaken, because power never revealed itself loudly. It revealed itself when systems started collapsing. And somewhere, someone very powerful had just realized something terrifying. The network had been seen, but the name sitting at the very top of the next file hadn't been spoken out loud yet.